Welcome to the Freak Show, fellow freaks.
I'm Matthew Brockmeyer.
And I'm Christa Carmen.
And this is...
Murder Coaster.
Ladies and gentlemen, today we will be uncovering the horrible connections between John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown, and Dean Corll, the Candyman. Namely, the Delta Project, a disturbing network that went by many names, including the Odyssey Foundation and the Hermes organization. The Delta Project was like a diseased and wretched octopus, reaching out its tentacles across the world, destroying lives. What you are about to hear today will shock you to your core, so be prepared. And know this, as it will be a recurring theme, the 1970s were fucked up. Really, really fucked up. The web of perversion, lies, and corruption reaching up into the highest levels of law enforcement and the federal government is sickening beyond belief. Get ready for a rough ride.
Let's begin. Prologue. Sleazy Houston. It was spring in 1971 when Stephen Dale Ahern flew out to Houston, Texas from California, looking for a new start. Stephen was a gay Nazi male prostitute looking to get into the pornography business. Yes, you heard that correctly. Stephen Dale Ahern was a male prostitute, white supremacist, and card-carrying member of the American Nazi Party.
Stephen had recently gotten out of prison for making terrorist threats. In the late 60s, he'd begun threatening to kill Robert Kennedy. He was obsessed with the senator. He'd call in bomb threats to airports, threaten to assassinate him, tell everyone the senator was going to die. Eventually, falling under the radar of the FBI and getting himself arrested by the Secret Service. 3 months after he was arrested, Robert Kennedy was, in fact, assassinated by Sirhan Sirhan. It was all weird. It was all bad.
But now it was a new decade. The swinging 60s were over, and it was the sleazy 70s. And as we've said, and will continue to state, the 70s were fucked up. Like, seriously fucked up.
Stephen had run a personal ad in the LGBTQ magazine The Advocate, expressing his desire to get into gay porn, which was answered by a fellow in Houston by the name of Roy Ames, who paid his airfare to have him flown to Texas for a photo shoot.
Roy Clifton Ames was a record producer and music promoter, specializing in Texas blues music. He had his own label called Aura Records, with lots of blues legends like Jimmy T99 Nelson, Leonard Lowdown Brown, Weldon Juke Boy Bonner, and most famously, Johnny Winter.
Johnny Winter would say this about Roy Ames. He was my manager, but never got anything done as far as my career. He just got a percentage of my records. We recorded some songs for Roy, but never made a penny. He said he was putting too much money into promotion and wasn't recouping enough back. Roy was also a pornographic artist. He took pictures of little boys to sell to perverts. He did that all the time, even when he was doing records. I don't think he ever stopped taking pictures.
While white supremacist and wannabe gay porn star Stephen Ahern was hanging out there in Houston, Roy Ames asked him if he'd like to go to a gay bondage and S&M party being hosted by his friend, Dean Corll. Yes, Dean Corll, the infamous Candyman.
And remember from our episode on Dean Corll, he used to brag about having ties with an international teenage boys' sex slave ring.
Roy Ames was known to groom children there in Houston. It was an open secret. Times were tough, and many poor children would do just about anything for a few bucks, some attention, and love. Kids like 15-year-old Donald Waldrop.
Donald Waldrop lived with his divorced dad, who was a construction worker, and started hanging around Roy Ames, who'd give him soda pop and beer in exchange for sexual favors, even letting himself be photographed by Roy. Eventually, Donald even started bringing his 13-year-old little brother, Jerry, over to the record producer's house.
Their father was aware of this, even knew about the naked photographs, and forbade his two boys from seeing the man. But they wouldn't listen to him and kept going, even running away to stay there. When Donald and Jerry went missing in February of 1971, their father told the Houston police that they were with a guy named Roy Ames, who was a, quote, homosexual who gathers kids and takes movies.
And the Houston police? Well, the Houston police just marked the case inactive, stating the boys were runaways. What the fuck, man?
2.5 years later, the boys' corpses would be found buried in the boat shack of Dean Corll.
And at the same time that the victims of Dean Corll were being discovered in Houston, just 230 miles north in Dallas, on August 13th, 1973, police were raiding the apartment of one Alan Hitchcock on 3716 Cole Avenue.
Alan Hitchcock was running a program called the Odyssey Foundation that connected poor, underprivileged boys with wealthy businessmen to mentor them and give them a head start in life. And Hitchcock had hired 21-year-old Charles Bursendi to be his assistant.
But Charles was horrified to discover that the Odyssey Foundation wasn't a mentorship program at all, but a nationwide prostitution ring selling the services of teenage boys.
Charles was gay, but he wasn't a pedophile, and he found the Odyssey Foundation beyond disgusting and repugnant. And furthermore, because Dean Corll's accomplice, Wayne Henley, was saying Dean had been part of a white slavery ring run out of Dallas, Charles was worried that he may have been referring to the Odyssey Foundation. So, wisely, Charles notified the FBI, who notified Houston police, who raided the apartment.
What was found in that apartment was mind-boggling in its scope. An international teenage boy prostitution ring with its own newsletter, all disguised as a legitimate self-help for troubled teens through travel program.
Using a newsletter called the Odyssey Foundation, Alan Hitchcock was flying teenage boys, who were called fellows, around the country to be quote-unquote mentored by elite businessmen called sponsors.
One of the detectives called it a case of, quote, kids for rent, and said some of the clients were very prominent people, including federal employees, judges, musicians, even the leader of a world-renowned orchestra.
When police burst into the apartment, they found 45-year-old Alan Hitchcock at a kitchen table, surrounded by underage teenage boys. On the table were photographs, like one might see from a modeling studio, brochures, newsletters, flyers, and box after box of index cards of clients in every state in the nation, as well as Canada. Parked out front was a pickup truck, the bed loaded to the brim with pornography involving teenage boys.
Allen Hitchcock was arrested for conspiracy to commit sodomy, was released on a $7,000 bond, and immediately fled the state. He never went to trial. There was no tracking system at the time, no registry for sexual offenders, and he simply vanished.
And the man's name wasn't Allen Hitchcock at all. That was just one of his many aliases. His real name was John David Noman, a longtime Houston resident, pimp, pedophile, and pornographer with a rap sheet going all the way back to 1954, 20 years earlier, for the molestation of a minor.
All of the index cards listing his clients were seized by the State Department, taken to Washington, D.C., and destroyed. Yes, instead of being investigated, they were destroyed.
The Texas detectives were aghast. In the end, 2 congressional subcommittees would be launched to try to uncover why these cards were destroyed. All the State Department would say was, quote, "We didn't see any passport violations, so we destroyed the cards."
The 70s were fucked up.
It was apparently what is called a deep six, when powerful and important people covertly and irretrievably have evidence destroyed to cover up their involvement in crimes.
Meanwhile, a few years later in sleazy Houston, in February of 1975, local police were trying to track down a stolen bicycle and randomly came across a warehouse containing 2 tons of child pornography. 2 fucking tons, including over 1,000 magazines and books, 1,000 reels of film, and 15,000 color slide photos, all of underage teen boys, some of it going back to 1965, meaning this pornography ring had been active for over 10 years.
The discovery in Houston led them to another warehouse in Santa Clara, California, where an additional 2 tons of material would be found, being distributed around the world by a company called New Atlas Distributors, which was sending it out as far as Sweden and Germany, run by none other than record producer Roy Ames.
Roy Ames was arrested and held on a $150,000 bond, facing 2 counts of sexually abusing children and 1 count of employing a child to sell and distribute pornographic literature.
In April, he was arrested again in Los Angeles at a warehouse located at 4932 Glenmont. There, they seized another ton of child pornography. He was charged with mailing obscene material and forcing boys into prostitution.
On July 25, 1975, Ames pleaded guilty to federal charges of mailing obscene films and magazines. He was sentenced to a federal prison in Springfield, Missouri, and when sentenced, Ames laughed at the notion that his incarceration would impact the operation of his business.
Roy would end up serving 11 years and would be released in 1986.
Investigators were able to identify 35 of the boys in the caches of pornography, and 11 of them were victims of Dean Corll.
Yes, 11 of the boys Roy Ames photographed ended up victims of the Candyman, Dean Corll. Utterly chilling.
But Houston police, the same police who decided to just stop digging and searching for dead bodies, even though both David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley said there were more, decided not to investigate this matter. Because get this, and this is a direct quote, "The parents of the boys have suffered enough."
The Houston police basically said that justice would not be served so that the parents wouldn't suffer anymore. The same parents they completely ignored when they begged them to find their missing children.
Yeah, the father of Donald and Jerry Wardrop says he literally camped on the police's doorstep, pleading with them to find his missing sons. The police coldly telling him they were runaways and to get lost. And now the police cared so much about the feelings of the parents that they refused to investigate the ties of the man who was at the time the nation's most prolific serial killer and an international pedophilia ring. What the fuck? It's insane. They were either absolutely in on it and totally corrupt, or incompetent to the point of mental impairment and straight up stupidity. The 70s were so fucked.
This, sadly, was just the tip of the iceberg.
Chapter 1: The Windy City.
A month after posting bail and fleeing Texas, John Norman, now going by the name Stephen Gurwell, set up shop 1,000 miles north in Illinois, in the village of Homewood, right outside of Chicago.
He's right back at it, but now changes the name of his organization from the Odyssey Foundation to the Hermes Foundation. The Odyssey being the story of Ulysses traveling home after the Trojan War, and Hermes, the Greek messenger god with wings on his ankles. Both names seeming to reflect the disturbing pedestry culture of ancient Greece, when men could have socially acceptable relationships with boys.
While living in the suburban enclave of Homewood, John Norman is busy sending out his newsletter and arranging rendezvous between rich businessmen and teenage boys. He's also actively grooming neighborhood boys and setting up a pornographic photo studio.
He uses the same exact ploys as both the Candyman and the Killer Clown to attract underage boys. First, on Halloween night, 1973, he lures a young teen named Kenny Hellstrom to his house.
He meets Kenny at a restaurant, starts up a conversation, then offers him a ride home. But instead of taking him home, he takes him back to his house and gives him a few free beers.
He's just acting like the cool uncle, the hip, understanding neighbor. He tells Kenny, "Feel free to stop by anytime, bring some friends, all the beer you can drink." And soon all kinds of kids are hanging out. I mean, come on, free beer. But like Dean Corll, the only rule is no girls.
They're partying, having fun, and John Norman starts showing them a little porn. First, the vanilla, straight stuff, guys and girls. But as the parties progress, he starts showing them man-on-man films and soon man-on-teen.
Then, just like Corll, just like Gacy, he starts offering the teens oral sex, saying it's no big deal, everyone does it. The kids are drunk, horny as hell from watching porn, and start letting him give them oral sex. According to the testimony of Kenny Hellstrom, the boys would line up to be filleted by John Norman, as many as 9 or 10 at a time. And soon, he's offering to pay them money to pose for naked photographs.
But a nosy neighbor starts noticing all the teen boys hanging out at the house, starts spying in the windows, and sees exactly just what is going on, and calls the cops.
One of the few times a nosy neighbor was a good thing. Detective Flannery from Homewood Police Department raids the house of ill repute and is shocked and disgusted by what he finds. There's all kinds of underage pornography, as well as photo equipment, tripods, lights, movie cameras, all the pamphlets, brochures, and 2,000 index cards listing the names of clients.
John Norman is charged with 3 counts of contributing to the sexual delinquency of a child and 5 counts of indecent liberties with a child, and held in the Cook County Jail with a bail set at $350,000, a huge amount in the 70s, equal to roughly $3 million in today's money.
The Chicago police say they too are interested in charging Norman and ask for the 2,000 index cards of clients, which are given to them, and they promptly lose them. Somehow the cards just vanish. Poof! They're gone forever. What the fuck, another deep 6. 70s were fucked.
Chapter 2. Phillip Paske.
to knock me out. Waiting for the knock to knock me out. Waiting for the knock. Coco, rest me. Catch a freight train rolling for free. This mojo will never come clean. On the fence or begging on my knees. I'll never know the truth behind why you arrested me.
While in the Cook County Jail waiting to go on trial, John Norman meets a 22-year-old tough, streetwise Chicago kid named Phillip Paske, who was awaiting trial for robbery and accessory to murder.
Phillip Paske is the shadiest character. We really don't know too much about him. His father was a city worker, and he grew up on the rough streets of inner-city Chicago. He is said to have been incredibly violent from a young age, openly bisexual with a love of cross-dressing.
He looks very 70s, blonde and just slightly effeminate, but big and muscular. Someone you wouldn't want to fuck with.
He and two friends had been attempting to rob a man's coin collection, but a struggle had ensued and his friend had stabbed the guy to death, and now Phillip Paske was in the Cook County Jail awaiting trial.
John Norman and Phillip Paske just hit it off. Two sociopaths with a love of money and perversion. John tells Phillip all about his international sex ring, all of his clients, some of whom are police officers and federal employees. And Phillip is all about it, and he wants in.
Phillip is tough and has local connections and offers John protection. And so right there in the Cook County Jail, they start putting out a newsletter for male prostitutes, using the prison printing press. Again, loosely disguising the language to appear at the mentorship program, calling the prostitutes fellows and the clients sponsors.
They're actually using the prison printing press to put out this newsletter. It's fucking crazy, man.
It really is just unbelievable. And here's a little section from the newsletter that Phillip Paske and John Norman put out from the Cook County Prison.
Try to maintain interest among fellows and sponsors. Schedules of the present fellows vary, but all are available, weekends and some other days within range of their bases. Phil, based in New York, is 21, 5'10", slender, with brown hair and eyes, a college graduate of diverse interest and unusual sophistication. Reggie in Maine is 20, 6'1", 155 pounds with brown hair, an ex-sailor who likes country life and the outdoors. Ray in Florida is 19, with black hair, a student who likes travel, music, and good times. Jimmy in Texas is 18, 5'11", slender, with hazel eyes, a delightful, vivacious youth who's always fun to be around.
Eventually, John Norman went to trial, and the teenage boy he had groomed, Kenny Hellstrom, testified that he met him at a restaurant on Halloween, and the man told him his name was Stephen Gerwell.
Kenny tells the jury how he was groomed, given alcohol, and shown pornography, eventually engaging in sex acts and being photographed. And John Norman is found guilty of contributing to the sexual delinquency of a child and sentenced to 4 years at the Pontiac Correctional Center.
Just months later, Kenny Hellstrom was on his way home from work when he was attacked and stabbed 6 times in the back. He managed to crawl home and scratch at the door. His mother answered, found him there bloody on the doorstep, and he died as she cradled him in her arms.
To this day, the murder is unsolved. It's not known who killed him or why, but as we'll see, when victims come out and testify against John Norman, they often come to mysterious ends.
Phillip Paske ended up taking a plea deal where he pled guilty to armed robbery and had the murder charges dropped. After serving 2 years, in 1976, Philip Paske got paroled. Once free, he starts running the newsletter from outside the prison.
And he doesn't have to wait long for his mentor, because John Norman ends up being paroled shortly thereafter, and the two get an apartment together, right in the heart of Chicago's Chicken Hawk neighborhood, there by Bughouse Square and the Greyhound station, and really start going at it, printing newsletters and flyers, giving their business a new name, the Delta Project. Delta, of course, being the fourth letter of the Greek alphabet.
Chapter 3, Michael Sneed and the Chicago Tribune.
In late 1976, Chicago Tribune reporter Michael Sneed received an anonymous package with a bizarre pamphlet in it, saying, "The Delta Project, education, travel, opportunity." When she opened it up, she was horrified to see it was all about quote-unquote boy love and an obvious front for an underage male prostitution ring.
Michael Sneed knew she had a story, but she had no idea where the pamphlet came from or who was involved. There was no address or phone number. It was a mystery. So not sure what else to do, she called the police and asked if they had heard of anything called the Delta Project.
The line went completely silent.
Hello? Hello?
After a moment of silence, the officer on the other end of the line hung up on her. The 70s were fucked, man.
So she went to her editor, Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist George Bliss, saying, "The cops won't even talk to me about this. I don't know how we can go any further."
But Bliss said he knew some people and would make some calls for her.
George Bliss had connections to all levels of the police, and after calling around, discovered that a vice unit was actually already investigating the Delta Project and trying to set up stings. And with some finagling, George Bliss got them to allow Michael Sneed to come along on their investigation with them.
At that time, the police and reporters really relied on each other for information, and they often worked together. So Sneed went out with officers as they investigated the Chicago boy love sex ring.
They did stakeouts in the Bughouse Square, around the Greyhound station, all the areas John Wayne Gacy lurked, watching these teenage boys, and sometimes even younger, sell themselves, trying to discern who their pimps were, who were the big players.
Sneed was dumbstruck by what she saw there on the cold streets of Chicago. It was an entire boy love world they were uncovering, what she would call a, quote, pond of perversity. They uncovered masses of child pornography, more and more pamphlets for the Delta Project. Extremely disturbing, they find many of the abused teens are in the foster care system and being exploited by their foster parents.
And it didn't take long before they uncovered the source of the Delta Project newsletter, John Norman and his henchman, Philip Paske.
On her last night with the police, Sneed went on a raid to a sleazy hotel on Sheridan Road. And inside the room, they found a foster father in the act of filming himself having sex with his foster son.
Jesus Christ. On May 17th, 1977, the Chicago Tribune ran the first of several exposés, the headline reading, "Chicago is center of national child porno ring."
The article specifically named both John Norman and Philip Paske, saying in part, quote, "The Delta Project established Delta dorms, dormitories in various states for boys, or cadets as they were called, that were under the direction of one member acting as a Don, an adult with a sexual preference for children. The Don sexually exploited these boys while acting under the pretense of protection or management.
The Tribune's expose was a bombshell, absolutely huge, blowing the lid off this underground world which called itself boy love, and leading to United States Senate subcommittee hearings on the topic of the protection of children against sexual exploitation. These hearings would lead to the formation of national child obscenity laws, sexual offender databases, tracking systems, and other modern laws and regulations.
One of the results was, before the hearings, it had been a federal felony to transport women across state lines for immoral purposes. But the law was changed to include males being trafficked as well. And the truth is, folks, including the FBI, just didn't understand how bad the sexual exploitation of boys was. They thought only girls were in danger of being sexually exploited and trafficked, and had no idea this world of boy love existed.
Chapter 3: The Killer Clown of Chicago.
John Norman was quickly arrested yet again. His home was raided, and he was caught in the act of having sex with 2 underage boys from a local foster home while taking pornographic pictures of them. One of the boys informed investigators that Norman was in the process of selling him to a client, and he was simply waiting for the plane ticket to arrive.
Because of the publicity, Philip Paske was fired from his job as, get this, so terrifying and disturbing, the children's supervisor at a fire department swimming pool.
Fuck. So, going underground and looking for work, Philip hooks up with the son of a guy he'd once robbed buildings with. None other than David Cram.
Yes, David Cram, the tough Chicago kid who had fallen for Gacy's handcuff trick, only to fight his way free. And David introduces Philip Paske to none other than John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown.
And Gacy actually hired him to do some work for PDM contractors. And this is not speculation. There is absolute proof of this. There are payment checks, time records signed by Gacy, and business ledgers to prove this fact. Philip Paske, right-hand man to John Norman, who ran the Delta Project, worked for John Wayne Gacy.
Gacy, who kept meticulous notes about his business, even had a handwritten description of Philip Paske in his files, which read,
Philip Paske, former employee, has apartment, lives with a prostitute which he pimps off, deals in drugs, hard, and sex for money, white slavery. I believe he is bisexual, takes hard drugs, smokes pot, pimps girls and boys for sex or movies. He has been at my home.
It would take nearly 40 years for this verifiable connection between the ringleader of a nationwide human trafficking ring, engaged in the procurement of teenage boys, and John Wayne Gacy, who killed at least 33 teenage boys, to be brought to the attention of the public, and was first reported on WGN television in Chicago by veteran anchor Larry Potash.
How could this identifiable connection between a human trafficking ring and John Wayne Gacy possibly have been missed by the prosecution in the most prolific serial murder case in the United States at that time?
John Wayne Gacy would later describe Philip Paske as, quote, John Norman's enforcer, end quote, and say that when David Cram introduced him, he said, and this is a quote, he's real cool. He even killed a guy.
Many speculate that the person Philip Paske had killed was Kenny Hellstrom, who had testified against his boss, John Norman, and ended up stabbed in the back 6 times. And as we'll see, others who testified against John Norman ended up murdered as well.
And even weirder, his name now ruined by the Chicago Tribune expose, Philip Paske begins going by the pseudonym Patches. Yes, Patches, Pogo the Clown's sad alter ego, also used by Gacy's employee, foreman, and roommate, Michael Rossi.
Some fucked up clown business going down there.
Did we say the 70s were fucked up yet?
Yeah. Chapter 4, Russell Lloyd Nelson.
Oh, how it goes in this stubborn town. No one seems to know how to get around. One said we say what we are and we do what we teach. Let me preach in my words. Oh, how it goes. Say something, anything. Do something.
Now things become murky. Very murky.
In October of 1977, Russell Nelson, a 22-year-old architect student at the University of Minnesota, traveled to Chicago with a so-called friend to check out the sights and get away for a little road trip.
He called his mother from Chicago to let her know he'd arrived safely, then went to a popular Chicago disco, and was never seen alive again.
And the friend that Russell had gone to Chicago with was a 30-year-old drifter from Belfort, South Dakota, named Robert Young, a very shady character.
Russell Nelson's mother then began receiving phone calls from Robert Young, who said he was actively searching for her son, but needed money to continue his efforts.
Robert Young became more and more demanding, and eventually Russell's brothers went to Chicago to meet this guy.
Robert Young then chillingly asked them if they were interested in a construction job, working for his friend, John Wayne Gacy.
40 years later, DNA would reveal that another victim discovered in Gracie's crawl space was from Minnesota as well, James Hackinson, who was 16 years old when he ran away from home.
It is unknown how James got to Chicago or why he even went there. Could he have been led there by the mysterious drifter Robert Young? Could Robert Young have been bringing Gacy victims? We don't know, and Robert Young is long dead.
Stranger yet, Robert Young was never called to testify at Gacy's trial. Why? We don't know. Possibly just ignorance. He could have just slipped through the cracks, but then again, there was absolutely no mention of John Noman or Phillip Paske or the Delta Project either. Did prosecutors think this would further complicate an already complicated case? Could cast doubt on Gacy's guilt? Who knows? We only know that the 70s was one fucked up time period. Fucked up and frankly, terrifying.
Also, much of this activity was happening in the neighborhood where Philip Paske and John Norman had an apartment together. We know that besides actively picking up male hustlers, Gacy was also actively collecting pornography. Gacy had been involved in the underground pornography business since the 60s, when he used it to entice new members to the JCs. Gacy's wife, Carol, said she discovered incredibly disturbing pornography of young males tied up and covered in blood. And one of Gacy's living victims said he forced him to watch violent pornography. John Norman not only sold pornography, he made it himself.
They all hung out in that same neighborhood by Bughouse Square.
Chapter 5. Andy Drath.
Oh, die without sound. Baby's round. Your chest, it's soaked in blood. From your veins.
The story of Andy Drath really goes to show how these sinister webs of abuse and murder interconnected in the fucked up 70s.
Andy Drath's mother died when he was 7 years old, and he was put in the foster care system. In 1977, when he was 15, Andy disappeared. His half-sister had long suspected he'd been a victim of Gacy, but could find no dental records to confirm it. But when the case was reopened in 2011, and investigators began using DNA to try to identify unknown victims, she supplied her DNA, feeling very sure there would be a match to one of the unidentified victims.
But there was no match. Andy Drath was not murdered by John Wayne Gacy. However, when her DNA was run, it went into a database of unidentified murder victims, and there was a hit.
Andy was murdered in 1979 in San Francisco, California, on Ocean Beach, where his body was buried in the sand. And when investigators began looking at the case, they discovered he was none other than the foster child that was being filmed in the sleazy hotel room by his foster father in 1977, when reporter Michael Sneed was working on her investigation into John Norman.
It's a small world. Andy Drath had testified against John Norman during his 1978 trial. Yes, another boy that testified against John Norman was mysteriously murdered, and many believe that he may have been murdered by Phillip Paske.
This leads to speculation that Phillip Paske may have been killing off boys he thought might come forward about the Delta Project. And since he was friends with David Cram, who had the keys to Gacy's house, burying them in the crawl space of John Wayne Gacy without his knowledge, including possibly Robert Gilroy, who appears to have been abducted while Gacy was out of town.
Gacy himself would state as much, saying his workers had the keys to his house and came and went as they pleased, and that the accumulation of victims dramatically increased once Phillip Paske started working for PDM.
The basic idea is that Gacy had killed Greyhound busboy in self-defense, then buried him in the crawl space. And when David Cram, Michael Rossi, and Phillip Paske discovered that Gacy had a body buried there, they decided to use the crawl space as a burial site as well. And that's where most of the bodies came from.
It's really a wild bit of speculation, and honestly, I personally don't believe it, especially concerning Robert Gilroy. Here's why. Robert Gilroy was not a hustler. He had no connection to Bughouse Square or John Norman, wasn't in the Delta Project. His father was a police lieutenant, and he didn't even hang out in downtown Chicago. He was a suburban kid from the Plains who lived just a few blocks away from Gacy. And all of the victims in the crawl space had the same cause of death: strangulation, piece of cloth shoved down their throats, which is how John Wayne Gacy killed, his M.O. The victims who testified against John Norman were murdered in different ways. Andy Drath was shot to death and Kenny Hellstrom was stabbed to death. Also, though Gacy tried to deny it, he was extremely active at that time. There were 2 victims from that time that lived, Robert Donnelly and Jeffrey Rignall. And the last victim, Robert Peast, was undeniably a victim of Gacy. There's just absolutely no denying that Robert Peast was killed by Gacy. So it just doesn't add up to me. But that doesn't mean that Gacy didn't have accomplices. Could Rossi, Cram, and Phillip Paske have been helping secure victims, even aiding in the killing? Absolutely. And there is actually some evidence pointing to that.
Victim Jeffrey Rignall, whom Gacy picked up and chloroformed but let go, swears that he saw another person in the house. A younger guy with hair parted down the middle, which matches both Michael Rossi and Phillip Paske, and that he saw a light turn on in the house during his torture, meaning there were possibly 2 accomplices there at the time. Though Jeffrey was heavily drugged with chloroform and foggy, going in and out of consciousness at the time.
And before Gacy's arrest, when he was under surveillance, 2 officers followed him to a bar where he encountered his roommate and foreman, Michael Rossi, aka Patches the Clown, as well as another PDM employee, Ed Hefner.
Gacy, who was beginning to crack, eating handfuls of Valium and slugging scotch, was heard saying to them,
"You better not let me down, you fuckers. You owe it to me."
The officers then overheard sections of a hushed conversation between Gacy and the 2, during which Rossi asked Gacy, "And what, buried like the other 5?
Chapter 6. The Big Easy.
Back in the old days, when you took photographs, you'd have to take the film in to be developed, and they'd be sent to these automated labs where they'd be bulk processed.
Yeah, getting photos could be weird. I remember my friend went to a photo place and said to the lady, "Is it cool if I get pictures of me growing weed developed here?" And she was like, "Hell yeah, honey. You can bring your nudie shots here too."
Wild.
And I know this girl, she's this crazy Portland punk rock girl who did a photo shoot with her friends where they used makeup to make themselves look all bruised and bloody. And it looked really real. They looked fucked up. And when she went to pick up the film, the cops showed up. And there was this huge, big hullabaloo over the photographs.
Oh my god. Yeah, totally different world. Well, on August 23rd, 1976, a photo laboratory conveyor belt in New Orleans randomly broke down, and when employees went to fix it, they discovered a horrible batch of photographs of 2 men assaulting an underage boy.
Police were called and started an investigation. The film had been dropped off under the name Harry O. Kramer, but there was no phone number, and the address provided was bunk.
Investigators set to studying the photos, looking for clues, identifying marks, a possible name or address, anything that could be used to identify the location, but they could find nothing.
But there was one clue. In the corner of one of the photographs, sitting on an end table, was a Boy Scout magazine. So they started searching out troops, asking about the name Harry O. Kramer, and found that there was one Harry Kramer, 22, who was an assistant scoutmaster to one Raymond Whittall, 38, of Boy Scout Troop 1237.
They soon ascertained that the men in the photographs were in fact Raymond Whittall and Harry Kramer, and raided their house.
In the home of Raymond Whittall, they find business cards, file cabinets, and Rolodexes for a business called New Orleans Tour Guide Services. That was a blatant front for a child sex trafficking ring.
And Boy Scout Troop 1237 itself was a complete front the men used to seek out boys from troubled homes they could exploit and abuse, finding them pen pals who were older men they'd send them off to.
Unfortunately, the Boy Scouts of America has long been a hotbed of pedophilia. There's an incredibly disturbing documentary on Netflix called Scouts Honor, The Secret Files of the Boy Scouts of America. It's fucking disgusting.
And that was just the tip of the iceberg. The investigation led them to an Episcopal priest named Reverend Claudius J. Vermeil, who went by the name Bud and ran a chapter of Big Brothers of America, a nonprofit organization whose mission is to, quote, create and support one-to-one mentoring relationships that ignite the power and promise of youth, where adult volunteers are matched with children from age 5 to young adulthood.
It's so fucked up. This priest was also part of a boys' farm for troubled youth, as well as child welfare services that connected foster parents to children. And this priest used all of these places to find boys he could exploit and abuse.
Investigators discovered written guidelines and procedures on how to groom disadvantaged boys to be sexually exploited and abused for profit. And clients of this New Orleans tour guide service included members of the police force and several congressmen. And it was a worldwide organization, bringing in men from across the United States, Switzerland, Holland, Germany, and Australia.
Raymond Woodall would receive a 75-year sentence and die in prison. His protege, Harry Kramer, received a 45-year sentence. A Boston millionaire and elite businessman named Hugh Scott Mallor, who was involved, received a 5-year sentence. And this is crazy. One of the owners of the New England Patriots football team, Richard Jacobs, was arrested for his involvement, posted bail, fled, and was never seen again.
The 70s were very, very fucked up.
And of course, there were ties between the New Orleans tour guide service and John Norman. Of course there were. It's said John Norman based his Delta project on the structure of the New Orleans tour guide service.
Chapter 7. The 80s.
After being released from prison in 1980, Houston record producer, music promoter Roy Ames, who'd once been friends with Dean Corll, went right back to producing pornography featuring teenage boys. These guys are textbook sociopaths who will never, ever stop what they're doing.
And on March 19th, 1981, Roy was indicted by a federal grand jury on a single count of interstate transport of an obscene film after he sent a pornographic film featuring 2 boys under the age of 16 to an informant in Springfield, Massachusetts.
And on March 24th, Ames was arrested in a Houston parking lot where he was trying to sell 25 pornographic films to undercover U.S. Customs and Postal Service agents.
Roy Ames was extradited to Massachusetts, where he went to trial. Musician and former Johnny Winter bassist Isaac Peyton Sweat testified against Ames, saying Ames had offered to use the funds from the sale of the porno film to finance his career, but Isaac refused.
Roy Ames was found guilty and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Isaac Sweat would later be found dead of a gunshot wound in his garage.
Ames was paroled in 1986. He would then begin ripping off any musician he could, releasing their demo tapes and shoddy bootleg material, which he then sold to an overseas market, being sued multiple times and becoming the scourge of the music industry, where he was universally despised.
On August 14, 2003, at the age of 66, Roy Ames died of natural causes at his West University home. He left behind no heirs. Upon hearing the news of Ames' passing, Johnny Winter would comment, "He died unhappy, At least that's good.
John Norman, the king of pedophilia, also kept right at it. After being released from prison in Chicago, he moved to Aspers, Pennsylvania, where between October 1983 and May 1984, he produced and published a child pornography magazine called Handy Andy from his rural home and a nearby cheap motel.
He exploited at least 20 teenage boys from the area, using the same old ploys, enticing them with drugs and alcohol, and photographing them engaged in various sex acts.
After his home was raided on May 31st, 1984, he fled Pennsylvania, but was captured in Bolingbrook, Illinois in October 1984. He was released on bail in March 1985 and again took off.
This time he made it on the run for 3 years, but was finally captured in August 1987 in Urbana, Illinois, and given a 6-year prison sentence for his crimes in Illinois.
He was then extradited to Pennsylvania and sentenced to 18 months to 36 months in prison for charges related to Handy Andy. A 1986 news report focusing on Handy Andy stated that Norman was wanted in 5 different states for child sex crimes.
Norman was then sent to Colorado, where he was convicted of child molestation in 1988, then to California, where he was convicted on an old charge of distributing child pornography. His prison term in California ended in 1999, but he was then declared a sexually violent predator and was detained indefinitely at the Atascadero State Hospital, where everyone from Charlie Manson to Edmund Kemper had once been held.
He was eventually released from Atascadero to the rural town of Boulevard, California, under strict conditions.
But of course, being a complete sociopath, he could not abide. And on February 2nd, 2009, Norman violated these conditions by giving a note containing his contact information to a 19-year-old grocery bagger in El Centro.
In March 2009, he was ordered back into state custody, this time at Coalinga State Hospital, where he died in 2011.
Good riddance. The world is a much better place with that piece of shit gone.
Hear, hear. After all the craziness of the 70s and the conviction of John Gacy, Philip Paske disappeared into the murky underworld of crime and debauchery.
Paske's activities became unclear. He was arrested in 1996 for possession of a controlled substance, and he died on November 9th, 1988, in Chicago from AIDS-related complications.
And lastly, David Cram took his own life in 2001.
Chapter 8, The Aftermath.
Do we really have? Is what we ever owned ever left the hand? And did economics mix with love? With stones and the trees and with up above? I don't own, I really don't own anything.
And so, now they're all dead. The only key player still alive is Michael Rossi, Gacy's foreman and roommate, who was Patches the Clown to Gacy's pogo. But he's not talking.
And today, investigators are still working to discover who the unidentified victims of the Candyman and the Killer Clown are.
Dean Corll's 11th victim is simply known as Swimsuit Boy because of the distinctive striped Catalina brand swimsuit he was wearing. Texas forensic anthropologist Dr. Sharon Derrick has taken DNA samples from nearly every bone in his body and did a full anthropological analysis, coming up with a profile stating he was between 15 and 17 years old, was of European ancestry, and using his skull, she's done facial reconstruction, coming up with a more or less accurate image of what he looked like in life.
One clue in possibly identifying Swim Shorts Boy is that on the t-shirt he was wearing, a peace sign over an American flag, someone had handwritten in permanent marker, very small beneath the peace sign, L84MF.
L84MF is a military expression for late for my own funeral. At the time of the boy's death, the Vietnam War was still going on, and it is thought that perhaps he knew someone or had a relative in the military who was making a comment about the peace sign.
Very eerily, and this is intense, Dr. Derrick received an anonymous package. In it were photographs of a teenage boy taken in the 70s, shirtless and posing provocatively, with a note saying his name was Bobby French and that the photographs were taken by Wayne Henley 15 minutes before the boy was murdered.
The images are strikingly similar to the facial reconstruction she did. There's the same distinctive jaw, the eye spacing, and the color of the hair matches perfectly.
An exhaustive search for a missing boy named Bobby French was conducted, and to this day there's images on the internet and a tip line, but so far nothing has come up.
Could he have been part of John Norman or Ray Ames's sex rings? They were both working in Texas at that exact time. Is this why he's so hard to trace? Because he was from a different state, far from Texas, and sent there as part of the Odyssey program? Is this why he posed for these photographs like that? Because he was being used as a model for these pornographers? We just don't know.
And most disturbingly, who sent those photos? How did they get them? Do they have more? Were they friends with Wayne Henley? It's all just so chilling.
And in Chicago, those several victims have now been identified in recent years through DNA. There are still 8 unidentified victims of John Wayne Gacy, one of the most mysterious being body number 28.
Gacy drew investigators a map of his crawl space, detailing where each body was. He also personally showed detectives where in the garage he had buried John Bukovich. But he failed to ever mention the victim buried by his barbecue pit, a victim who has come to be known simply as Body 28.
The body was found there through sheer diligence of Chicago police and sheriff's department. After tearing the house apart, they began excavating the backyard and cracking open the large concrete barbecue pit where he held his infamous parties. When they did, the faint scent of death came wafting up.
There, investigators discovered the skeletonized remains of an unidentified boy. The grave itself had been dug by Tony Antonucci, whom, if you remember, had narrowly escaped the handcuff trick and certain death, and had to wrestle the killer clown to the ground to escape. Tony had been perplexed as to why Gacy insisted he dig a nearly 4-foot deep hole for a barbecue pit, and even more puzzled when he returned the next day to see Gacy had filled it in with concrete himself.
Why had Gacy kept this body a secret? He undoubtedly killed this person and buried the body. There's no question about it. This is way before Mike Rossi and Phillip Paske had even come around. It was his second victim. And at one point, Gacy would say that this was the first one he'd used the rope trick on.
Forensics determined the victim was slightly older, most likely 21 years old. Could he have been a male prostitute involved in the Delta Project, and Gacy kept his mouth shut about him out of fear of retaliation? Those who spoke up, remember, often ended up dead, and Gacy wouldn't start talking about John Norman and Phillip Paske until over a decade later when he was on death row and was desperately trying to avoid execution. And even then, he'd be evasive. When interviewed by famed FBI profiler Robert Ressler, He stubbornly refused to confirm or deny anything about accomplices.
And as we speak, in Chicago, Cooks County Sheriff's Lieutenant Jason Moran is seeking answers. He submitted the DNA to genealogical testing, which looks for family members, and got a hit, narrowing the gene pool of where the victim came from. He's believed to have been from outside the Chicago area, but the family tree is still being constructed, and it still remains a mystery.
And the DNA of Gacy's victims has proven to be very difficult to deal with. The bodies were covered in lime and acid and buried for a long time, some for years. And then, after being excavated, the remains were cleaned chemically before they were buried again, this time in a memorial grave. All of this has seriously degraded the DNA.
And with every day that passes, more relatives to the victims die, meaning there's less of a living genealogical family tree, less DNA to test, and less of a chance of discovering just who they were.
So much of this remains a mystery for the ages. But we know one thing for certain. The 1970s was a fucked up time period in American history.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to the end of our series on the Candyman, Dean Corll, and the killer clown, John Wayne Gacy.
Thank you so much for listening. As disturbing as it was, we hope it was enlightening, and we hope that DNA evidence continues to shed new light on the victims.
70s are so fucked. And do you have a case you'd like us to cover? Let us know at murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. That's murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you so much. We will see you next week.